Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving right into Dr. David Bauer's incredibly fascinating insights into the grand finale of the ancient book of James. Specifically, we're picking it up at James chapter 4, verse 13, and taking it all the way to the very end of chapter 5. This final cycle, it's an absolute masterclass. It brilliantly contrasts human arrogance with divine reliance, delivering a striking, super dramatic conclusion to a deeply practical text.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today's journey. We'll be covering, first, submitting to sovereign will. Second, warning the self-sufficient. Third, patience for the oppressed. Fourth, the power of prayer. And finally, rescuing the wanderer. As we go through these, we're going to trace this vivid dichotomy between arrogant wealth and suffering patience, discover the sheer power of prayer, and see exactly how all of this culminates in communal restoration.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, submitting to sovereign will, the ultimate anchor. We're starting with the foundational theme that grounds this entire ancient text. And this really isn't just some lofty theological concept. It's the core lens through which James expects us to view every human interaction, every decision, and every trial.
Literally every argument James makes in this final cycle boils down to one big idea: the total rejection of self-rule in favor of trusting God's ultimate plan. Dr. Bauer points out that this section is deeply concerned with how we respond to the utter unpredictability of life. I mean, think about it. When circumstances totally spiral out of your grasp, what's your default reaction? Do you panic and try to forcibly seize control? Or do you patiently submit to God's unfolding action? Because for James, leaning into human self-sufficiency is a total dead end.
Moving right along to part 2, warning the self-sufficient, the arrogance of wealth. Let's look at our first specific group and see how James issues this stark, uncompromising warning to those who think they hold all the cards.
Dr. Bauer highlights this core dichotomy, and honestly, it's fascinating. James essentially splits his audience into two camps based entirely on their deepest temptations. On one side, we have the self-sufficient wealthy. They're tempted to believe they possess absolutely everything, even the days ahead of them. Then, on the totally opposite end of the spectrum, we have the suffering, the oppressed, who feel entirely powerless and are tempted to think they have absolutely nothing at all.
Just look at the profound contrast in how these two mindsets actually speak. First, James targets the arrogant merchants bragging about their airtight business plans. They're out there confidently claiming, "Oh, today or tomorrow we'll go to this town, spend a year, and make a massive profit." But James counters that huge illusion of control with a humbling reality check. Our lives are just a mist. We're here one second, gone the next. So the only grounded response is, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. It's a really bold call to embrace the fact that our future belongs strictly to God.
Then, James pivots hard. He shifts his focus from urban merchants to rural landholders. And Bauer notes something truly interesting here. James uses the specific Greek term plosiai. Now, in James's writing, this word is used exclusively to target the wealthy elite outside the church. So we aren't talking about rich members sitting in the congregation. These are powerful, non-Christian landowners who are ruthlessly exploiting people in the broader society.
And the list of their crimes? It's staggering. It paints a picture of horrific abuse of power. They aren't just comfortably wealthy, they are aggressively hoarding resources. They use manipulative legal loopholes to systematically defraud vulnerable workers out of their hard-earned wages. They live in absolute, insulated luxury while turning a completely blind eye to the crushing poverty all around them. And by doing that, they're effectively condemning the righteous poor who have absolutely zero systemic power to fight back.
James hits them with this biting, brilliant irony. He tells these oppressors that their wealth is already decaying. Now, scientifically speaking, gold and silver don't literally rust, right? But James is making a massive theological point. Their hoarded wealth isn't actually a secure asset, it's a poison. That very rust will serve as a terrifying, fiery witness against them at the final judgment. The very security they thought they were building is exactly what will condemn them.
Which brings us to part 3, patience for the oppressed, waiting on the Lord. Having dealt with the oppressors, we flip to the other side of this historical dichotomy, the oppressed laborers. These are the faithful workers getting defrauded and dragged into corrupt courts.
So, the crucial, burning question we arrive at is this. When you are facing massive systemic injustice and crushing poverty, how exactly does James tell you to react? It's a very raw, real question. These people are being robbed blind and have absolutely no legal recourse.
Well, instead of violently rebelling against the state, and instead of taking out their massive frustration by grumbling against each other, which James specifically warns against, he paints this really beautiful, grounded picture. He uses an agricultural metaphor they'd know intimately, a farmer patiently trusting the seasons. The farmer knows the crop is precious and totally worth waiting for. They endure the harsh weather, just as ultimate vindication from God is profoundly worth enduring for.
He anchors this call for endurance deep in the Hebrew scriptures, reminding them, hey, you definitely aren't the first to suffer unjustly. Think of the ancient prophets who spoke truth to power and ended up in literal pits. Think of Job. The guy lost everything, his vast wealth, his health, his family, yet he steadfastly maintained his trust. And in the end, they all saw the profound compassion and mercy of the Lord. Their stories are basically a vital blueprint for how to patiently wait on God's justice right now.
All right, on to part 4, the power of prayer, bridging pain and deliverance. Next up, we explore the absolute primary tool James hands this suffering community to bridge the massive gap between their everyday pain and God's ultimate deliverance.
James narrows his focus to a very specific, deeply felt kind of suffering: physical sickness. See, in the ancient world, being sick didn't just mean your body hurt. It brought severe social stigma and absolute isolation. So for those marginalized by disease, James prescribes this highly specific communal protocol. You don't just suffer alone in the dark. You call the elders, they pray over you, and they anoint you with oil in the name of the Lord. It perfectly merges physical care with profound spiritual intercession.
And this is where it gets absolutely brilliant. The specific Greek words used here, sozo and agero, are super intentional. Dr. Bauer explains that in the ancient Jewish mindset, sickness was viewed as a sort of cosmic bondage to the present evil age. So when James says the prayer will save the sick person and the Lord will raise them up, he's signaling something massive. It's almost like a hidden Easter egg. Physical healing in this life is actually a sneak peek at the ultimate cosmic resurrection at the end of time.
To prove without a shadow of a doubt that this faithful intercession actually works, James drops this famous quote about the sheer effectiveness of a righteous person's prayer. He uses the prophet Elijah as his ultimate example. Elijah was a guy just like us, right? Yet he prayed fervently and literally altered the weather patterns for years. Can you imagine? A human being changing the weather through the sheer power of their connection to God.
But, and this is a huge but, context is everything here. In this ancient context, the righteous man isn't some powerful, untouchable religious elite. The righteous man is the oppressed laborer, the very person being systematically defrauded by the wealthy elite. James is making a breathtaking point. Your worldly powerlessness actually translates to immense power with God. Because you have zero standing in corrupt human courts, the Creator's ears are uniquely, powerfully open to your cries. Finally, we hit the climax of the book in Part 5, Rescuing the Wanderer, Communal Responsibility. We are officially shifting our focus from the physical healing of the body to the urgent, vital, spiritual rescue of the soul.
Dr. Bauer really hammers this home. The faith James describes is fiercely, intrinsically communal. Sin and wandering, they aren't just isolated personal issues. They send shockwaves through the entire body of believers. That means we have a direct, non-negotiable responsibility to each other. When someone wanders away from the truth, our response cannot be quiet revulsion or just backing away. It must be an active, earnest, loving engagement to bring them back.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with one final, deeply penetrating question to see if we're actually living out the wisdom of James. Are we out here arrogantly plotting our own futures like those self-sufficient merchants? Or are we patiently submitting to God's sovereign will, resting in His justice, and actively fighting for the spiritual survival of the people right next to us? It's a massive challenge to leave you with today. Keep digging into the text, and I'll catch you next time.